Hi there and welcome to my living room in Budapest. My name is Gergely Kőhegyi and in the next 15 minutes I would like to sketch you a pattern on the potential role of German experimental psychology on the emergence of marginalism. First of all, I have to note that this is a work in progress, and the main motivation of it is a historical research concerning the Marginalist Revolution of the 1870s and 80s, which is generally considered as a transition period from classical political economy to neoclassical economics. However, at the moment, there is no satisfactory answer to the following questions: why did it happen? Why did it happen when it did? Why had it been accepted? And was it a gradual transition or a fundamental break in the economic thought? In answering these questions, it's worth to distinguish three different stages: the preliminary, the revolutionary, and the canonization stage, which can be characterized with emblematic figures. But my main research question is that in these stages, is there any potential inspiration from the wider field of other sciences beyond, of course, the inspirations from the narrower field of economics? In this presentation, I will focus only on the role of psychology, and the Austrian school is out of the scope now. If I had to summarize the secondary literature, Schumpeter, Stigler and Coder deal a bit with the potential role of the Bernoulli hypothesis directly or indirectly throughout the works of Laplace, and the potential effect of the psychophysics of Fechner or the experimental psychology of Wundt on Marshall, Edgeworth, Wicksteed, Pareto, Wicksell and Luyo-Brentano, and how we Creedy and Newman provided a sociological explanation on how these German schools came into the British story, and the key figure in this explanation was James Soley, who was on the one hand Edgeworth's best friend and on the other hand one of the main propagators of these German results in Britain. In my opinion, it's useful to separate the Bernoulli hypothesis, which gives us a functional relation between the own amount of money and its evaluation, from the psychophysics, which presupposes some kind of psychological reductionism. Because, for example, Edgeworth seems to accept both, but Pareto rejects definitely the possibility of psychological reductionism. If we would like to understand why especially Germany was a place in the world at that times where numerous theorists of mind started to take serious the experimental methods, then we have to emphasize first that German idealism and romantic natural philosophy, where the possibility of the psychological level was a central question after Kant, were the two dominant traditions, and these are very different from the British and French trends. And second, it is very important that the great educational reformer Wilhelm von Humboldt, who was very influential and who was fighting against the narrow-minded approach in higher education, made mandatory philosophy courses at the medical faculties and introduced also natural science courses into the art faculties. This led to the fact that many scientists and philosophers came from the universities with the actual problems of German philosophy in mind and having at the same time the tools of natural sciences. Many different schools were founded that are enumerated on the right hand side of this slide, and if you would like to discuss their roots, then besides the evident inspirations from the science of medicine, we have to emphasize the role of philosophy, first of all the philosophy of Schelling and his criticist Johann Friedrich Herbart. Extending the earlier stream with the documented relations from the history of psychology, we can depict an arrow from Herbart to Fechner, who motivated the use of mathematical formula in generating psychological laws, and the direct and an indirect link from Schelling to Fechner, Wundt and also Helmholtz. But if we get back to the case of Marginalist Revolution, I have to underline that one of the protagonists of the revolutionary stage, the forgotten one, Hermann Heinrich Gossen, lived in that period in the country of those scientists and philosophers that are indicated with red color in this stream. The historical problem or challenge is that we don't know much about Gossen's life and inspirations. No diary, no autobiography, no correspondence with any of his contemporaries, not even a picture, only a single book, of which the publication was a complete defeat in Gossen's life. I put on the slide the main steps of his mysterious rediscovery, the main sources from the secondary literature, and also a short biographical sketch. But now let's turn to the discussion of the first chapter of his book on the economy of the isolated individual. Although the other chapters also contain some original achievements on the nationalization of land, rent, capital, and exchange. He starts with the declaration of a hedonic standpoint that man should organize his life so that his total life pleasure becomes a maximum. After that, he states his famous axiom, namely, the magnitude or intensity of pleasure decreases continuously if we continue to satisfy one and the same enjoyment without interruption until satiety is ultimately reached. And he also represents geometrically this idea on the decreasing intensities of pleasure with the help of a diminishing function in general, but after that he argues that a linear function is better to represent his ideas. I have to note here that the independent variable of this function is time instead of quantities. So the total pleasure depends on how many time was spent on the enjoyment in question. Few pages later, he formalizes his theorem on the simultaneous enjoyment of several pleasures, which is referred to as Gossen's second law, and in which he declares that the total pleasure is maximal when the consumer consumes several pleasures simultaneously, if from switching from the first enjoyment to the second one, from the second one to the third one to the fourth one, and so on, the intensity of pleasure is the same. The main problem is that Gossen failed to refer his predecessors. It's quite plausible at the first glance to assume that Bentham served as the principal source for him, and that's true that the German translations of some of his books were available at that time. But as Gergely Kőhegyi points out, these translations contain not even a hint of the utility law, and furthermore, as Kortum, Gossen's nephew, reported, Gossen was very little inclined toward reading, so it's quite unlikely that he came through these very long books and extracted a law-like statements from them which was not explicitly stated. Kauder hypothesizes that for a Rhineland citizen as Gossen, who was notoriously anti-Catholic, it was rather the French hedonism of Helvetius and Maupertuis or the positivism of Comte which could serve as a primary source. However, we don't know whether Gossen could speak or even read in French, but we know that he took a course on Molière's Tartuffe at the university, and that's also true that he defines himself as a preacher of the new positive religion of science during his book. So this influence of the positivism sounds quite plausible, but I haven't checked this French connection yet. What about the direct effect of Adam Smith? Because an invisible hand-like argument was repeatedly used throughout the chapters. First, I have to note that the instructor of one of his two courses directly in economics was Peter Kaufmann, who was a propagator of Adam Smith in Germany. And second, that the only reference in the Entwicklung to an English author can be found as an indirect reference in the civil service examination essay in finance of Gossen throughout the book of Karl Rau. So he had to know the book of Caro, which also contains the main theories of classical political economy. But none of these arguments can explain the idea of diminishing intensity of pleasure and even the use of mathematics. It is of course possible that he read the original work of Bernoulli, or at least Laplace's philosophical essay on the probabilities, because Gossen himself uses the notion of probability in a later chapter, but the French language problem arises again with this argument. Here I have to add that Heinrich Hermann's book, which could serve as a source in the education of a civil servant, refers to Laplace's work, but it doesn't well express the Bernoulli hypothesis, and it's not referred by Gossen. As concerns the potential role of the Weber-Fechner law, we know that it was published later in 1860. But the original idea and also the formula can be found in the appendix of Fechner's Zend-Avesta, which is not a scientific work, it's rather the outline of his spiritualistic philosophy, but it was published 3 years earlier than Gossen's book. Okay, so in principle, he could read it. But for that, Gossen had to follow the contemporary literature in spiritualistic philosophy and in natural sciences, so it's quite unlikely. Finally, I had to note here that Johannes Müller was a professor in Bonn during the study years of Gossen there, and we know that Gossen had a wide range of interests, so he took courses in astronomy, mineralogy, mathematics, so it is possible that he also took a course in physiology, but it's not documented. So there are arguments and counter-arguments, but now let's turn to the potential role of Herbart. First of all, I have to emphasize that there is a direct reference to Herbart's book, Psychology as a Science, in one of the examination papers of Gossen. And furthermore, if we disregard of a reference to a theorist of law, this is the only reference to someone other's scientific theoretical work considering all the writings of Gossen. As I mentioned, Herbart was a criticist of German idealism and romanticism, and a very influential one in this period, whose goal was also to provide a scientific foundation of psychology. But as a psychologist, he was an exceptional one because he made no experiments, but used a lot of mathematics in describing the processes of the psyche, as you can see also from this excerpt. Actually, he started from a physical analogy and supposed that the forces of the nature are the general causes of the dynamics of the mental processes, and if we would like to understand them, we have to start with the discussion of their static equilibrium. The key concept of his theory was the representation, which can be considered as an elementary component of cognition, so color, an odor, or a taste. And as long as these representations arise simultaneously in general, our task is to determine their inhibition sum because they made an inhibition upon each other, and to determine means to calculate because these are mathematically handled quantities. Let's suppose first that we have two different representations, A and B, that are completely opposed, and the intensity of B is higher than the intensity of A. In that simple case, the inhibition sum will be equal to B and A is totally dimmed. But even in that case, we can calculate the proportions of S that are distributed to A and B. But in general, if we have more than two representations, then we have to start with the highest intensity representation, which is A, and that example, and when it is inhibited by the others and synced to the level of R, then comes the highest intensity representation B, and both are inhibited and synced to the level of R prime and R capital, and then comes the third highest intensity representation C, and we can continue this process towards the infinity because we cannot imagine a situation where there is no representation at all. I have to notice here that this conception is very similar to Gossen's theory, where the individual enjoys several pleasures simultaneously, and first the highest intensity pleasure was satisfied, then comes the second one and the third one, and so on, also towards the infinity. And moreover, if we consider Herbart's explanation on the decrease of the partial effect of representations, then we will see a very similar figure that can be found in Gossen's book, where he explains the decrease in the intensity of separated pleasures. And if we take a look on the mathematical formula where Herbart describes the proportion of the representation and time, we will see almost the same equation as in Gossen's work. And finally, if we turn to the dynamics, where we would like to describe the change of representation z in time, so it's also time the independent variable, and following Herbart, we suppose that the intensity of the stimulus, denoted by beta, is constant, which can be interpreted as the brightness of a color, an intensity of an odor, or of a taste, or of a sound, and this stimulus is infinitely many times repeated, also as in Gossen's theory. And we can compare these examples with Gossen's introductory examples for enjoyment, where the first one was enjoyment of an art of work, the second one was a conversation with someone, the third one was a discovery of a new truth, and only the fourth one was a material pleasure. Then we can conclude that these are representations in the Herbartian sense, but only on a higher level of cognition. And if we regard the differential equation in which this dynamic process results, then we can see that the path of this solution is exactly the same as was represented by Gossen as a limit curve of the enjoyment of multiple pleasures. And now, let's get back to my stream where I depicted the potential but undocumented relations, with dashed lines the potential but unchecked relations, and with simple line the documented relations of Gossen. If I had to summarize, first in my presentation I gave the main characteristics of German experimental psychology, first of all the potential causes of its development. After that, by separating the law of psychophysics from the Bernoulli hypothesis, I identified only Edgeworth and Gossen as the potential subjects in relating the German experimental results and marginal utility schools. I dealt only with Gossen, and I took into account all of his potential inspirations and argued for the dominance of the influence of Herbart on Gossen, and my arguments are based on a direct reference, on the similarities in mathematical reasoning and in the conceptual framework. And finally, I would like to conclude that based on my research, probably there were no direct effect from psychophysics to the marginal utility theory of Gossen. But I think there were common causes, and the most important among these common causes was the philosophy of Johann Friedrich Herbart. I highlighted on my unified stream these most important relations from the point of view of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.